Years ago, I used to play in the Fools and Heroes live-action role-play campaign in Britain, and it was sort of all right. There are lots of things I liked about the system. I would say that the scenarios broke down roughly into thirds. That one third of them were really quite good and enjoyable, one third of them were and one third of them were just awful. But there you go. Sometimes it seemed worth it for those one third that were good. Now, one of the aspects of the fantasy world where they were called races. Perhaps they could have been called species, but anyway, they were called races: dwarves, elves, and so forth, and humans, of course. And there was also the half-orc, the half-elf, and so forth. And some of these were not very satisfactory races, I would say. They were a bit like an excuse for a race. It was, oh, I'll just decide to be this race just so I can be a little bit different, but I'm only really doing it because of some advantage I get in statistics rather than, playing a character who's more interesting, and surely that should really be your priority. So, for instance, there were an awful lot of people who played half-elves. Why? Because they didn't have any of the disadvantages of elves, or any of the disadvantages. Essentially, they were just like humans, but they got an extra resist, that is, a chance to resist an incoming spell against them, a little bonus that the system gave them, so a lot of people just thought, well, I may as well be a half-elf then. And you didn't have to go the whole hog with your costume and buy the full elven stuff, but you were supposed to have little pointy ears. But a lot of people playing half-elves would just put a little bandana or something around that would hide the top of their ears, and that was cheaper and easier than making pointed ears. And hey presto, they then after that just behave like a bog standard human character who was indistinguishable from everyone else, and you couldn't even be prejudiced against them because you didn't know they were half-elves. It was quite important for them to show that they were half-elves, so that I as my character, if I'm playing some bigoted enemy of elves or whatever, someone who just doesn't trust half-breeds or whatever it is that I am, I can't play that character properly if I don't know that this person is meant to be a half-elf. Now, if there were a fantasy world and there were actually such things as elves, then presumably by looking at him I'd be able to see the shape of his face or whatever, his accent. There'd be some giveaway clue. Oh, I see, half-elf, huh? Right. So I just felt that half-elves were just not very interesting. But I have an idea, which you may want to put into your campaigns, for making half-elves and perhaps half-orcs and others more interesting. And that is, perhaps humans and elves are actually different species, in which case perhaps they're sufficiently similar, a bit like horses are sufficiently similar to donkeys, that they can interbreed, but the children they produce are infertile. So, if you get a slightly strange horse and a slightly strange donkey and you introduce them to each other, the result of this can be a mule or a hinny, depending on the sex of the father. The species of the father, the species of the father, or the sex of the horse, if you prefer, but obviously all fathers are going to be male. So, moving on. Now, mules are different from both horses and donkeys. They have slightly different behaviour patterns, different personalities, if you like, and different physical characteristics. You can spot, if you know a bit about horses, you can spot the difference between mules, donkeys and horses quite readily. And people living in a fantasy world which had half-orcs and half-elves in it would be able to do the same, one would imagine. So people would immediately spot you as a crossbreed, and you would be infertile, because if you get two mules that love each other desperately, they can't produce offspring. You keep having to go back to donkeys and horses to breed more mules, because donkeys and horses don't actually have the same number of chromosomes. And so when they produce a creature, it doesn't actually have the right equipment chromosomally to splice with another one and produce more of itself. So these mules, are infertile. So immediately you've got a really good reason why in character someone could massively disapprove of his son marrying an elf, because he won't get any grandchildren. There will be no grandchildren. Instead there'll be these weird mules that everyone will make fun of. And would it be interesting to play one of those mules? Because you're something quite different. No one's going to want to marry you, presumably, because you're not going to be able to produce any children, and maybe your instincts are going to be quite different from both humans and elves. Maybe you'd be rather asexual in nature, perhaps. Maybe you would be shunned by society, which explains why you ended up being an adventurer. In fact, it could even be that perhaps there's something in the personality of these half-elves, these half-orcs, these half-breeds, these mules, that and that could be a a name for them. People could say, oh yeah, a bit of a mule, meaning a bit of a half-breed. That could be like an insult for these people, or maybe not. Maybe it's the currently, no, we don't call them half-elves anymore. They're called elf mules. That's the current euphemism or politically correct term for them. But then later people say, no, you can't call me a half mule or whatever it is. You can see it introduces more interesting stuff about what do you call these people? How do you react to them? Are they attractive? Are they repellent? Are they trustworthy? Suddenly, being a half-elf becomes enormously more interesting if you just introduce this idea that they are like mules. They have different instincts and they cannot produce children, in which case they have nothing to pass on to the next generation. These are people who perhaps don't care so much about their legacy because they know they're never going to have a legacy. Maybe that's why they became adventurers. Or perhaps they're suited to being adventurers because of their particular instincts. Maybe they're very fearless or curious or restless or something. Or maybe society just shuns them so much that they have to be adventurers. So there you go. I'm putting the idea out there. Perhaps half-elves are like mules. And perhaps that's what makes them interesting.
Did